we can't just wish the rest of the world away. While we might have the Atlantic and the Pacific, we got airplanes, you got the internet. What happens overseas doesn't just stay there.
Hi everyone, I'm Ian Bremmer and welcome to your GZERO world here in Rockefeller Center, and this week we have big elections in Italy. We've got Trump and tariffs, will he or won't he, on steel and aluminum globally. And we have North Korea, maybe a breakthrough in negotiations. A great, and I mean that, episode of Puppet Regime, you'll find out in just a bit. And the big interview this week on the show, I've got Representative Joe Kennedy from my own home state of Massachusetts. He's the one that gave the response to Trump's first State of the Union. We'll talk about that and a lot more. But first, your world this week. We'll start with big elections in Italy. Over 50% of the Italian population vote for either the Five Star Movement or the Northern League, both anti-establishment parties. The most explicit repudiation of the governing forces in a major developed country, really since World War II. These are very unhappy people that say that the center-right, the center-left, whether it's Berlusconi or Matteo Renzi, they want these guys out. They want something new, and they don't care if they govern very well. Now, it's not going to matter all this much in Italy. They've had over 60 governments since World War II anyway. It's going to be weak. It's going to take a long time to put them together. They won't be able to accomplish very much. But it does matter for the rest of the world. And the reason is because there was a hope among some that Emmanuel Macron in France, when they voted for him, that was the end of all of this populism. We could get back to governance as usual. But no, Macron may like globalization, but he was also someone from the outside, someone that said these old political parties are no good. There's actually consistency here, which the average European, the average American, whether it's Brexit or whether it's Trump or Bernie Sanders or now whether it's Italy, are all saying we don't like the people that are in charge. We think you're lying to us, and we're prepared to do something about it. The votes are going to get more polarized as a consequence. Europe's going to get harder to govern. The transatlantic relationship is going to get weaker. President Trump surprising just about everybody, including his own advisors, and saying he wants to roll out big tariffs on steel, 25% around the world, aluminum, 10% around the world. People don't like it. The Wall Street Journal said if he does this, it's going to be the single stupidest thing he's done as president. The Journal generally likes Trump. The governors, Republican governors, the mayors, Paul Ryan, his advisors internally, most of them, including the top economists, they're all saying, don't take this step. Now look, Trump may well roll it back. Don't take the tweets at face value. He said that if the Chinese help him on North Korea, he's going to work with the Chinese on trade. Doesn't that include steel and aluminum tariffs? It already sounds like the art of the deal, like he's looking for a compromise. But if he does decide to go forward with big tariffs, what we're going to see is the Europeans, the Canadians, and the Chinese all lining up together to take on the United States at the World Trade Organization. This is Trump as a unifier as opposed to a divider, unifying everybody else in the world against him. That's what we saw in reaction to the Paris Accords, what we will see in reaction to big tariffs if he decides to go forward. The North Koreans have been on a roll recently. They had a great stint in the Olympics, then they've had meetings with the South Korean senior delegation, up with Kim Jong Un, who even gave him dinner, and now they're agreeing to a summit. Kim Jong Un and South Korean President Moon. They're also saying they're willing to talk to the Americans. They're even willing to talk about denuclearization. How about that? I am very skeptical. The idea the North Koreans would give up their nukes, which they desperately need to sort of stay alive, at least from their perspective, seems to me just about zero. But President Trump has gotten something done here. He pressed the Chinese to push the North Koreans on sanctions or else. That's been effective. It brought the North Koreans to the table. They're also saying they're willing to suspend or freeze tests of their nukes and ICBMs in return for nothing but talks. That's also moving the needle. Trump deserves credit here. Now, can the United States actually execute on eventual negotiations with the North Koreans? Trump has virtually no experience, and he's lost a lot of his senior diplomatic personnel on the issue. That's going to be tougher, but at least for this week, the Korean Peninsula is looking a little safer. And now, it's Puppet Regime.
And now, a word from the President.
Great again.
But it wasn't. president, but it turned out that we've had a few, like we've lost a couple countries to democracy. I'm here in the West Village with Congressman Joe Kennedy, representative from my own home state of Massachusetts, 4th District, his 3rd term. I'm delighted to welcome him to the GZERO. Joe, delighted to have you here.
Appreciate it.
You were asked to deliver the response to President Donald Trump for the State of the Union. What was the immediate thought that went through your head? And was there something like, I know I have to hit this?
I think it was really important to try to put what we have seen and what our country's experienced over the course of the past year in context. I expected that the president would do a good job during this speech, but I also think it is important to tell the story that I think he isn't telling and that his administration isn't telling, which is the impact of some of those policies on other populations across our country. And what I interpret to be, for the first time, certainly since in my lifetime, a definition of politics, of American politics, of being zero-sum. No longer is this one where a rising tide will float all boats, where there is a common vision for success in our country. It's one where in order for one set of Americans to win, somebody else has to lose.
Somebody else in the United States?
Somebody else in the United States has to lose. And so I think putting that in context and saying, we have a government now that is choosing to try to benefit some at the expense of others is not an American ideal.
What do you think that Trump has actually done well in his first year?
No one should be arguing against an increase in the stock market. No one should be arguing an increase in continued job growth. That's a good thing.
And you're suggesting he's partially responsible for that?
You can't sit there and say these numbers are great for Obama and then all of a sudden say that Donald Trump and his administration doesn't have something to do with it. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, do I think you can sit there and point out the fact that while the administration continues to highlight these increasing stock numbers, that 50% of Americans don't own a single stock, and about 80% of stocks, 80+% of stocks are controlled by about 10% of American families. That being said, I gave that speech from Fall River, Massachusetts, which is a post-industrial manufacturing community. The median household income there is $34,000 a year.
As opposed to 61 or something like that for the country.
For the country. And so when you start thinking about, are the policies that are being put forth by this administration actually meant for communities like Fall River? I think it's an emphatic no.
We've just seen the United States go through a pretty interesting fight on NRA, right, and on gun control. And Trump, who is, typically been more with the Republicans and supported by the Republicans for the first year than anything else, seems to have last week done a kind of an about face and say, I want you guys to hit the NRA. I want to ask you about special interests, but before I do, specifically on this, where do you think this is real? Do you think the country has actually seen an inflection?
I hope it's real. I will tell you that I think the person that has the most power to make it real is the President of the United States. If he is willing to push his party, to push some of his most ardent supporters, to recognize the fact that there's a way to, I think, stand behind and stand for the Second Amendment, and also recognize that we have an epidemic of gun violence in this country and we can do something about it, and we have the power to do something about it, and to accept the status quo and say essentially that this is the price of freedom in this country. No, it's not, and it shouldn't be, and shame on us if we let it be.
Do you think we're making progress in big areas of legislation for the average American right now?
Not enough. Right? Certainly not enough. I think that I think that this administration, obviously we're going to have our disagreements, right? I think that this administration, this president in particular, I think he's shaken up Washington, no doubt about that. I don't think he's shaken it up in the right ways. I don't think that doubling down on the way that corporate tax bill basically went through actually shakes the place up. I think it ended up being much more of what you would have expected from a traditional conservative administration. There were opportunities there to actually really empower middle class, and I don't think the vast majority of those benefits are going to go that way.
So we've got midterms coming up. If it turns out that your party's actually winning after November, how does that change the way you think about how the country's being governed?
Regardless, you still got a Republican president. And so if you're going to try to move the ball forward and actually get some of these changes signed into law, they're going to have to be bipartisan. So part of this is going to be, yes, a question for Democrats as to what extent do we want to work with this administration. Part of that is also going to be a question for the administration as to, is he going to be willing to pivot as President Clinton did? And as they said, triangulate a way to move forward and actually still notch some victories, rather than just kind of become under siege and start swinging back at House Democrats. I hope he chooses the latter.
How do you convince your constituents that the rest of the world actually matters?
That is one of the key questions that I think we as a country are struggling with. And on the one hand, on an intuitive level, my constituents know it. It's their sons and daughters that are off fighting overseas. We can't just wish the rest of the world away. While we might have the Atlantic and the Pacific, we got airplanes, you got the internet. What happens overseas doesn't just stay there. Whether that happens to be, again, disease or terrorism or violence or ideas and automation and innovation. And the opportunity in that means that if you are able to dominate that space, you will capture those global gains. The concern is that if you lose it, as one business owner told me in Fall River, Massachusetts, who used to be a supplier for a global company, said that the moment that they were undercut by price by a penny, their business dried up.
Does that story, does that recognition and understanding change the way you think about the world, given that you represent those constituents?
Foreign policy starts at home, and it comes back into the investments that we need to make to strengthen our competitiveness in communities like Fall River, through education, through fair tax policy, through these investments in infrastructure, making sure that those communities are equipped with the tools that they need to compete. Look, Boston, Washington, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they will have the tools to compete. They're going to attract highly educated workforce. They're going to attract the investment dollars. They're going to do all of that. But if you can get priced out now because Amazon's going to drop off a box in 24 hours at your doorstep instead of having to go outside and walk down to the corner store, you got to make sure that the corner store can compete too.
A lot of Americans feel like free trade isn't working for them. How do you respond to America First as articulated by President Trump?
You know, I think that's extremely short-sighted and extremely dangerous. What that means is that it's essentially the United States, a place that is founded on the idea that everybody counts, that we all are created equal, are essentially saying not everybody is created equal anymore. That's up to your own domestic policy, and as long as we can get a good enough deal with you, that makes up for it.
So the explicit promotion of liberal democracy, in your view, around the world is something the United States should actually have as a core mission.
That's what I believe our country has stood for and at our highest moments defends. It doesn't mean that you have to go become the policeman all over the world. We can't afford to do that. We should be strategic about how we choose to make that point. But at the moment, you see an administration that is totally shifting back from making that point at all on the hopes that essentially those folks that might not rank high enough can get sold away enough for a sweet enough deal. And that, I think, is short-sighted, misguided, and in the long run, extremely dangerous because you have an emerging countervailing government philosophy from rising geopolitical rivals that do make that strategy explicit. And I worry what that means for the United States as we start to lose that moral high ground of saying, no, just because you happen to have a different gendered spouse, you still count, when all of a sudden we've started bargaining those people away. To try to make that case again becomes an awful lot harder.
Joe Kennedy, you squint a little bit, you can almost see a president.
Behind me, maybe.
There you go. Good to be with you, Matt.
Thanks.
And that's your show this week. Come back with me next week, and I've got Ali Soufan. He's in charge of the Soufan Group and one of the world's top experts on security and terrorism. I'll see you then.